co-founder of DLA Ignite. With me today, I've got Salman, and what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about his book, Wandering Spirits. Before I get you to introduce yourself, Salman, I just wanted to say a couple of things about that. I really enjoyed it. Now, normally we do business books on here, but and I've got a big pile of business books. But I saw you on LinkedIn and I saw this book and I thought, this kind of feels really interesting. And I think my audience would be interested in this because it's different. So just to explain to everybody, you've written this book called Wandering Spirits, and it's about fables. So that's setting up the conversation. So Salman, where can people find you?
Yeah, they can visit my website. It's just Salman, SALMAN.io, the letter I and then O. And yeah, you can find me on socials and other places through there. But I write a newsletter, so you can subscribe on there and get some updates. But yeah, thanks so much for having me on here.
You're welcome. A book on fables. You've got an IT background, and now why have you written a book on fables?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think a lot of the audience might resonate with this, but I've been building startups most of my life. I started out as a software engineer at an early stage startup and spent maybe like 5, 6 years building that. We were acquired into a company. I did another startup as a founder. And then I kind of hit a pretty hard crash with some burnout, and really just had to take some time out. I call it like involuntary sabbatical, where I really was kind of confused and sort of broken a little bit. And I started to explore a lot of random things that I used to do maybe as a kid, some things that I always kind of wanted to do. I had this list. It was like a little notepad. I called it like the freedom list. And it was just like, if I could do anything, what could I do? And one of those things was drawing. One of those things was writing, and I started to write online. And I've been writing this newsletter where I publish essays, and they're more. I kind of when I started to start writing, I thought I would write about startups. I thought I would write about, hey, I've been building startups for like over a decade. I've got all this stuff to say. I'm sure that's what it's going to be about. And when I sat down to write, I just didn't want to talk about it. I just was like, I already had my whole life for that. What else can I talk about? And so instead, a lot of the sort of, I guess, explorations I had been doing in, meditation, spirituality, those kinds of things that I had just really enamored me a little bit are the things I ended up starting to write about. And so I kept that up, and I even wrote about sort of this idea of being more of a generalist, sort of polymath, as some people call it, where you don't have to just be this one thing, because that was a big thing on my head, where I was, oh, am I like a startup founder? If I'm not a startup person, what am I? I'm nothing then. So I had to figure out identity and stuff like that. And to fast forward, I just started drawing funny looking animals. And then one day I realized, like, hey, I could write stories about them. I gave it a try. And a lot of the stories, these fables, are actually channeling lessons that I learned. And some of them, actually, one of the fables in the book is about burnout. It's called Horses Race.
Just so you could see, this is one of the pictures that Salman's done, which is on the horses, which is my favorite story, and this is one with the bird. So it's fully, well, it's illustrated in terms of the book that you've created.
Yeah, yeah, and that was another challenge too, was kind of illustrating it myself, and really pushing my boundary, because I had done illustration, but it's different to illustrate a whole book. It's like you got to get a whole pipeline of drawings to do it. But yeah, I think a lot of these stories just came through without much intention. I think that's what happens when you put yourself in a position to sort of let your creativity flow, is like these things that are in you, they're just going to come out, and they're waiting to come out. So that's another thing. That's a message I've been trying to share with other folks, is like, people like me who kind of spent their whole life in tech, building startups, we have other things to say. Like, we have other sides of us. We just need a little permission, actually. We just need to give ourselves permission to play, And I would encourage, especially to approach it as play and not as like, oh, I need to go and do a creative book thing or whatever. Just mess around, because that's how it started for me. I had no real intention of writing a book. It just kind of
Hmm.
appeared later.
And I think for me that was something that was really important, was the fact that you didn't sit down and say, I've done tech for 10 years, I'm going to go away and write a book, which is quite often what people do. Is that
Yeah,
it's kind of it's evolved itself.
that's right. Yeah, I think especially because I think a lot of times the framing of why you do anything complicates your decision making. So what I mean by that is like, even if I'm talking to my peers, and I tell them like, "Oh, well, I'm not sure. I'm not doing another startup now, but I'm just sort of like doing these experiments and stuff." And they're like, "Oh, are you gonna, launch a course?" And I heard that you can make a lot of money from that. And I was like, I don't know. A lot of the things that we want to do, that we really deeply want to do, aren't going to be, revenue sources right away, especially for folks who are coming from tech. And we've just been really lucky. People who work in tech, we just get it's been a little easier to find financial stability for folks in that world. If you go into the arts world, it's a lot harder to make money from that. So you got to do something that you really want to do. That's another thing I would say is like, I've actually seen this happen, and I've had it play out with peers of mine where like they'll kind of burn out a little bit from building companies and being an entrepreneur, and then they'll quit, and then they'll go and sort of go their own path. And instead of like giving themselves space to play, they'll be like, okay, well, now I'm going to launch this and launch that. And suddenly they have another business. And it's kind of like, this is not that different. Don't create another cage for yourself. Just, which is why I encourage lots of folks, like, you don't have to quit your job. I was writing a lot of the newsletters and a lot of the essays while I was working full time for a long time. And even now I still work at a startup, and I kind of do it part time. That gives me space to do both things. But yeah.
So I was interested in your so in each of these fables, in effect, it's a story about that you've written. So I mean, the frog one, for example, is about people who sit around doing nothing. Right?
It's what's interesting is like, what I love to see is that different people pull out different things. Like, they see different things, and it's because they've seen that. And so and one of the things about the reason why I wrote the story about the frog is like, well, I mean, I won't spoil the story, but this frog is kind of figuring out
Hmm.
like, what's the secret? Like, all right, whatever. That person who's successful, like, they must have some like quick trick or some kind of trick, right? And you see that a lot where people really want like a nugget, like, okay, that's all great, but just tell me the one thing, and then I'll go and do that, and I'll be able to replicate your success. And we see that a lot in society where actually the you just kind of have to keep working at it a long time and figure out and iterate. And so that one's another one where there's little scenes that are from like experiences that I've had. In other cases, it's not my life, but other things that I've seen. And it is really a fun process to try and translate those into cohesive stories, because they've still got to have structure and lessons and things.
Without spoiling the end, what happens is that the frogs sit around all day playing cards, and this one frog is trying to work out what's going on, and it looks out across, and it sees beavers building a dam, and they're all very, and they put this dam together, and he says to the beavers, "What are you doing?" "Well, we built a dam." And he's going, "Well, we're playing cards all day, but the beavers have built this dam. Wouldn't it be great if we built a dam, or built something?"
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think a lot of probably your audience would understand that desire and understand sort of the struggles with that desire. But I've also had folks in different, like, the interesting thing about writing stories like this is they appeal to all kinds of audiences. And so I meet a lot of people who have nothing to do with tech, have never worked in any of these, and so I remember someone was like, "I don't really understand that part. Like, what do you mean? Do people really, like, do people have this issue or that? They've never seen it, because they've worked in a completely different world. So that's another thing, that I've been really enjoying, because tech can kind of be insular sometimes. Like, everyone's in tech, and you're talking to people about tech, about and kind of like, okay, and so doing creative stuff gives you a chance to just meet the most random people, and it's really it's really fun. It's really been a fun aspect of it.
And you said that the book's been read by both children and adults.
Yes, yeah. So I'm inspired by that book right there, The Little Prince by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. That was probably the book that really, I mean, I had read it as a kid, but then I read it again as an adult. And for those who haven't read this book, highly recommend it. There's also a great Netflix adaptation of the film. Excuse me, a film adaptation of the book, which usually adaptations aren't great, but this one's really good. Um, but anyways, the gist of it is kind of this lesson of, there's when we grow up, when we become adults, we forget what's important. Society just sort of trains us out of remembering these really basic things that children seem to know. Children seem to know, like, oh, I'm here, I'm just going to play. They don't have to sit and think about these things, or they know what they care about very deeply, and they don't constantly have to justify it. Anything, like we were saying just now, anything that you're doing, you have to justify. You have to have a good reason for why you're doing that thing, so that when people ask you, you can tell, oh, well, here's my plan. Here, blah blah blah, and kids are like, I don't need a plan. I'm already doing it. They're not even talking to you about it. They're just doing it. Um, but what I loved about this book was, like, kids read it, but it's really relevant for adults too. And he had, the author had written it in that way. And I was like, I kind of would like to write something where, it's for kids, because that's a lot of these lessons and stories like this are written for kids, but kind of want to write it for myself. Like, I would, want to be able to read something like that. And obviously, it's a classic. I'm not trying to compare it or whatever, but that was big inspiration for sure.
Because when we did the preparation call, you said that kids basically sit down and read it from end to end,
Yeah.
whereas adults can only kind of read one story at a time. So I thought,
Yes.
well, I'm going to read it from end to end. I couldn't. I ended up doing the one story. I had to do one story. I did one story every evening.
Yeah. Well, I also think probably because you're thinking deeply about, maybe what did I take from the story, and you kind of need to process it and stuff. Whereas kids, they kind of absorb things, in less intellectual ways. I feel like they're really taking it in, and it's wonderful to see how it shows up. So I've had this happen a few times now. Like, nephews or friends' kids will read the book, and the way that they tell me they read the book is they make a storybook. So it'll have like these full papers, and they'll draw pictures, and there'll be a whole story, and there'll be little things in there that are clearly, either lifting or trying to reference something from the book. And they don't need to tell me, oh, I liked the this story and this part of that story, and what. They don't need to say anything. They just make something. And through that, they tell you that. And I find this really incredible, because again, they don't need any permission. You know how much permission we have to give ourselves to, like, make a thing? We're so scared, like, oh, no one's gonna like it, or people are gonna think we're dumb, or like, what am I doing with this career path? All that. They just made it. It's just done. And it is really cool how quickly they get into it, and they get so excited about it, and then they go and make something like that. So they're very different consumption mechanisms, but both are important. I mean, my dream is, I hope it would be kind of awesome if someone grew up and read it again and found something different, the way that I did with Little Prince. But I mean, who knows? The way that our world is evolving, I don't even know if books will be around. Who knows? It's going so fast. But yeah, it is cool to see.
So, what have you learned about storytelling in this process?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Um, well, firstly, I think it's been interesting to see that I've been writing nonfiction essays, which have really resonated with people about certain topics. And then I also have these fables now. So sometimes I have something I want to express, and I'm like, oh, well, which should I do? I could literally tell you what happened and how I feel about it, or I could create this abstract vehicle for you to absorb. And I think what I've learned is in either way, you have to really feed it to people as a story and not as a sort of lecture about some information. There's a book called The Science of Storytelling by Will Storr. It's a long book with a lot of really compelling information. But just the first chapter just talks about how we process uh, anything that happens in reality,
Yep.
and the gist of it is that like because there's so much information that we see and hear, we can't actually process all of it. Right? It's just too much. So your brain has these little filters, like almost like an algorithm that's like picking things. It's like, okay, that happened, and it's literally packaging them into stories. So you don't actually like see. It's hard to. I don't know how he explains it a little bit better, but you don't actually see anything. You just are told stories by your brain about what you saw, and this is kind of crazy, but this is basically how we process reality. And so when people tell stories, they're basically providing it ready made in the package that we like already, and that's why people really like stories. And I think that if you really understand this, you can see how and why storytelling is important, like in every facet of life. And when we think of stories, it's not just, written down a story, but a story in what you're writing, a story in what you're saying, a conversation at a party, a presentation, all this kind of thing. Um, but I do also, as much as, but the last thing I'll say on it is sometimes it's really important to be very literal and specific. This happened to me, even though, I don't know who else this happened to, but I'm going to be very specific that this happened to me and this is how I feel and this is me. And people, it becomes, there's a saying, the very specific is actually the most universal, right? Because if you're just saying like general things trying to appeal to a bunch of people about the story, like it doesn't appeal to anyone actually. But when it's really specific, you come in. On the other hand, when I write fables, because they're abstract, sometimes I'll have people be like, "Oh, I love how you wrote the story. It's about this and this, and it reminds me of that time that this and this happened." And I'll be like, "Yeah, I mean, I didn't write that. I didn't write that at all. But the vehicle is there, and if it evokes something and then it serves its purpose." So it's been really interesting to see how different vehicles and stories and can be used. They're really, really powerful and really important.
Yeah, I didn't think I didn't see myself as a creative person until I wrote my first book.
Mm,
And even though it was a business book, it was only at that point that I did see myself as a creative person. And I guess it's a bit like, when Elton John writes something like Your Song or something, and people say, well, and they project something about their
right,
lives on that. And he
right.
sits there and goes, well, that's not what Bernie and I wrote the song about. But
Yeah.
it's really interesting that you've said that. And
Yeah.
that's part of the creative process, isn't it?
I think it is. And I do think that's like a debate that will go on forever is like, is the story or the song or the book the thing that the author intended, or is it whatever that person takes away from it? And,
Mm.
because I've had people be like, well, no, well, tell me what it's supposed to mean. Like, tell me that. And I'm like, what do you think? What did you take away from it? Because that matters. That really does matter a lot. And to me, I really like leaning on the side of what you interpret it, mostly because I just feel like we have to recognize, you and I can look at the exact same thing, read the same sentence, and we're reading different sentences because we don't have the same glasses. Like we have completely different filters based on our realities anyway. And so, it's actually kind of a delusion to think, oh, someone is going to exactly receive what you sent. It doesn't happen that way. You send something and they'll receive it based on the color of their world, their experiences, their upbringing. And I think that's kind of the beautiful thing, we all hear and see different things based on what melodies we've listened to. So
Yeah, you said something to me at the preparation call, which is pointless creativity. Great stuff comes from it.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I will say that has been the single most useful, but also difficult to apply lessons that I've learned because as someone who has spent I think there's a lot of people like yourself included, and many of your audience, I'm sure, like we're just, if you've worked hard and you've been successful, you've had to really push yourself to be efficient and prioritize and be smart about what you do, and push projects forward and that kind of thing. And that muscle gets really strong, and then it becomes a primary muscle at all times. So if you put someone in a room and you're like, just do whatever, they'll start to get anxious, like, I mean, you're just like, what do you mean? Well, and there's a comedian slash philosopher, is how I'll describe him, called Bo Burnham. I don't know if you've seen him, but he has this show that he's been doing for a while in different ways, and he has had a special called Inside recently. But anyway, it's very insightful about the nature of our society's experience today and how we experience things. One of the things that he said, and I'll paraphrase him, but we sort of have this weird thing now where we're not always really experiencing the current moment. We're sort of planning it. Like, so some people will kind of like have an experience and then they're already imagining like how it's going to look when they write about it or when they post about it. And I think the same phenomenon applies to giving yourself permission to do stuff without a purpose, because sometimes you sit down and you're like, oh, okay, I guess I'll play with, like, if you put a bunch of clay in front of someone and like play with it, they'll be like, okay, well, if I make this thing, it'll be like that thing I made when I was a kid. And then I'll have a story to it, and I'll play some nice music, and I'll be like, oh, it's good to you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying this to, demean any, we all experience this, and it's very difficult to escape that. And so it took a lot, actually, a lot of time for me to really sit and find, and meditation honestly really helped, and journaling helped. And it took months and months before I was like actually content just sitting there and doing stuff without any real purpose. And that's when the real stuff started to come out. The other thing, and I'll just say this because I'm sure audience members are listening to me, and they're probably thinking this is like,
Still listening to you, yes.
They're like, one of the difficult parts is that people are gonna try to take that permission away from you. And like, when I would tell people what I was doing, I actually had people really like, some people would just get angry at me. It's very strange. But I guess if you think about it, it makes sense. They'd be like, why are you wasting time doing that? Like, you should be doing another thing. You have potential. Like, you already did one. Like, why are people like you waste all your time? And I was like, what? Huh? I wasn't expecting. I was really kind of floored by it. But I realized, like, sometimes, people are really trapped a little bit in sort of, whether they're, one example is a founder, but something else, or whatever job you might be in, and you don't really like seeing examples of what your life could be like if you went and did other things. And you have to just, and that's okay. It's okay for people to be upset about that. And it's just, some people haven't faced it. And when you go up to them and you try and like sing your, hey, I'm doing this and great, like, cheer for me, right? You're my friend, right? And they don't give you that reaction, like, don't be surprised. That would be my, like, just sort of note, is like, society is not always going to welcome you or reward it. And a lot of times you'll get kind of weird looks. Even now that I've published this book, I went to like a meetup. I won't say what, but it was kind of in the mix of arts and tech, let's say. And people would hear me. I would tell them what I'm doing, and they'd be like, "Oh, that's cool. We wrote a book, Fables." And then someone else would be like, "Yeah, well, he was also a startup founder." And they'd be like, "Oh, wow, blah blah." And I was like, "No, I don't like yeah, that is, I don't, it's not like I'm not proud of that. I think it was great, the work that I did, and I feel good about that. But you can quickly tell people just need very specific things to see you as a worthwhile individual, and this makes it very difficult to do these random things. But I guess if I can say one message is persevere past that, and give yourself space to discover that little kid in you, and it'll come out, and cool things will happen.
So, just to mention your book again, it's called Wandering Spirits: Modern Fables, and it's not a business book. It is about fables, and it's got lovely little drawings in it. So there's the frog there, and there's even the beavers there as well.
Yes, he is.
So where can people find you?
So yeah, so on my website, salman.io, you can check out essays that I've written. You can check out samples, subscribe to my newsletter, and you can get the links to the book, which is on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and all those kinds of places. There's a paperback, ebook, and also an audiobook, which I narrated, where I do some voices and accents and stuff like
Wow.
that.
Thank you so